Imagine a clock on the wall. But it's not the one in your kitchen, and it's definitely not the digital one on your phone screen.
Right.
It doesn't tell you when your next meeting is or, when you need to pick up the kids. This clock is arguably the only one that actually matters in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists' doomsday clock.
Exactly. The doomsday clock. And right now, it is sitting at 90 seconds to midnight.
Which is, I mean, it's just a terrifying statistic. It's literally the closest we have ever been to the symbolic end of humanity.
Yeah.
Closer than the Cuban Missile Crisis. Closer than the height of the Cold War back in the 80s.
It really puts things into perspective because when you see that minute hand ticking that close to 12, you realize we aren't talking about, trade disputes over electric vehicles here.
Right. No.
We aren't talking about who snubbed who at the G20 summit. We are talking about existential risk. We are talking about the actual mechanics, the nuts and bolts of World War III.
It forces a certain clarity of thought, doesn't it, when the stakes are that high?
It really does. And so the question we're jumping into for this deep dive today is just massive. How do great powers, specifically looking at the United States, China, and Russia, how do they coexist on this planet without blowing each other up?
Because right now, looking at the news, it feels like we are failing at that very basic task.
Completely failing. And to explore this, we're unpacking a really high-level, incredibly dense debate between two absolute titans of international relations theory.
Yeah, this isn't just pundits shouting at each other on cable news. These are the architects of how we actually understand the world.
On one side of this debate, you have Professor Jeffrey Sachs. He's an economist, a diplomat, the guy who has been in the room where it happens for decades. He looks at the world and sees problems that can be solved with rational cooperation. He's essentially the guy saying, look, we have a brain, let's use it.
And then on the other side, you have Professor John Mearsheimer. And if you follow geopolitics even a little bit, Mearsheimer is the realist.
The ultimate realist.
Right. And we don't mean realist like, oh, I'm realistic about my budget this month. We mean structural realism.
Which is a whole different beast.
It is. It's the belief that the world is this cold, tragic, completely anarchic place where nations are just destined to clash, regardless of how nice or well-intentioned their leaders might be.
Precisely. So they were brought together by a moderator, Glenn Deason, to hash out this brand new concept that Sachs is proposing. He calls it spheres of security.
Spheres of security, yeah.
And our mission today is to unpack that concept for you. Is spheres of security the blueprint to save us from Armageddon? Or, as Mearsheimer argues, is it just this lovely fantasy that completely crashes against the hard rocks of how the world actually works?
And for you listening, whether you're glued to the news about Ukraine or you're worrying about Taiwan or you're just a history buff, this discussion really explains the mechanics behind why nations go to war.
Right.
And more importantly, the theoretical blueprints for how they might actually stop. It's dense, it's nuanced, and it is arguably the most important conversation happening right now.
So let's start right at the beginning. Spheres of security. When I first heard that term, I thought, okay, this just sounds like academic jargon.
Sure, it does sound a bit dry at first.
But Sachs is very specific about what it means, and maybe even more importantly, what it does not mean. He starts by distinguishing it sharply from the old school term we all kind of know, which is sphere of influence.
Right, and that distinction is absolutely crucial. If you don't get this part, you miss his entire argument. Sphere of influence has a very negative connotation, and for a very good reason.
Yeah, historically speaking.
Historically, a sphere of influence meant a great power, say, the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe during the Cold War. They didn't just protect that region, they owned it.
They were the puppet masters.
Exactly. They picked the governments, they extracted all the resources, they demanded exclusive economic control. If you were Poland in the Cold War, you couldn't just decide to trade with whoever you wanted.
No, you were locked in.
You were in the Soviet sphere, and that was the end of the story. It implies total domination.
So Sachs comes into this debate and says, we need to stop using that model. That model is dead. He proposes spheres of security instead. And the distinction here is really fascinating.
It is.
He defines it as an agreement where great powers agree to stay out of each other's neighborhoods militarily.
That is the operative word right there, militarily.
Yeah. The golden rule he proposes is basically, stay out of my face. No military bases, no alliances, no missile systems on the border of another great power.
Right.
But, and here's where it gets really interesting for the smaller countries, it is not an economic exclusion zone.
That's the crucial nuance Sachs is really pushing in this source material. In his vision, a smaller country, let's say Ukraine or Mexico, isn't a prisoner to the great power next door.
Right, they have agency.
Exactly. They can trade with anyone they want. They can join political bodies like the EU. They can sell avocados to China or wheat to Africa. They can take investment from whoever offers the best terms.
So they get to participate in the global economy fully.
Yes. The only red line, the absolute only thing they cannot do, is host the military forces of a rival great power.
Which honestly sounds like a much better deal for those smaller countries. You get to make money with everyone, you get to grow your economy, but you don't get turned into a forward operating base.
Theoretically, yes, it sounds great. It maximizes their economic freedom while supposedly neutralizing the security threat for the big neighbor. And Sachs uses a really colorful historical analogy to explain this difference, which I thought was just brilliant. The Tale of Two Roosevelts.
Oh, I loved this part. It really anchors the theory in American history. It makes it so much easier to grasp.
It really does. So first, you have Teddy Roosevelt, the Rough Rider.
A man with a big stick.
The imperialist, essentially.
Right.
Teddy Roosevelt championed the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Now, the original Monroe Doctrine basically said, Europe, stay out of the Americas. But the corollary added a twist. It said, not only does Europe stay out, but we, the United States, have the explicit right to police the Americas. His attitude was essentially that the Western Hemisphere is ours to manage.
And as Sachs points out in the debate quite bluntly, the policy basically meant the U.S. could kick the shit out of anyone in the region if they stepped out of line.
Which is the exact definition of a sphere of influence. It's a relationship based on do what we say or else total domination.
But then Sachs points to the other Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933. FDR introduces what he called the good neighbor policy.
Which sounds so much nicer, right? Like, won't you be my neighbor?
It sounds like Mr. Rogers, yeah. But it was actually a radical shift in foreign policy. FDR comes in and says, we will not intervene in your internal affairs. We won't overthrow your governments. We won't do covert regime change.
And interestingly, in the source material, Sachs notes that he actually checked the historical record on this. He references a book by Lindsay O'Rourke on covert regime change and points out that during the FDR administration, the U.S. actually stuck to that promise.
They really did.
They didn't conduct covert regime change operations in Latin America during that specific window of time.
So Sachs is basically saying to the modern world, be like FDR, don't be like Teddy. Create a system where the U.S., China, and Russia can all look at each other and agree, I won't put my missiles in your backyard and you don't put yours in mine.
The ultimate goal here is what they call the indivisibility of security.
The indivisibility of security. Let's unpack that term.
It's the core idea that one state cannot make itself safer by making another state less safe. Think of it like a neighborhood. If I build a giant armed fortress right on our shared property line, I might feel a lot safer inside it.
But I'm going to feel incredibly threatened looking at it.
Exactly. You feel threatened, so you build an even bigger fortress. Sachs wants to break that cycle entirely. He wants to create a world where security is mutual, not competitive.
It sounds so reasonable. I mean, it sounds civilized. Stay out of my face and we won't have a problem. It really appeals to our basic sense of fairness.
It does.
But this is exactly where Mearsheimer steps in. And the dynamic in the source between these two is fantastic, because Mearsheimer clearly respects Sachs. He calls him a friend during the debate.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of mutual respect there.
But he basically looks at this whole theory and says, Jeff, that is a beautiful idea, but it is absolutely not how the planet Earth functions.
Right. Because Mearsheimer is the master of the tragedy of great power politics. And we really have to define that word, tragedy, the way he uses it.
Because he doesn't mean tragedy like a sad movie where the dog dies at the end.
Exactly, no. He means it in the classic Greek theatrical sense. A tragedy is inevitable. The characters are trapped by the mechanics of the plot, and no matter how good their intentions are, they are pulled toward disaster.
So let's look at this realist rebuttal. Why does Mearsheimer think this sphere of security idea is just doomed from the start?
It all starts with Realism 101. Mearsheimer argues that the single defining characteristic of the international system is anarchy.
Now, when normal people hear the word anarchy, they think of, like, the purge. People running wild in the streets, burning cars, total chaos.
Right, but in political science, anarchy just means there is no global 9/11. There is no higher authority in the world above the nation state.
Right.
If Canada suddenly decides to invade the U.S. can't call the global police to come help. The U.S. is the police. Because there's no higher authority to enforce rules or back up treaties, Every nation is living in a constant state of paranoia about its own survival.
And this leads right into what's known as the security dilemma.
Exactly, the security dilemma. You can never be 100% sure what your neighbor is actually planning. Are they building that massive army just to defend themselves, or are they building it to attack you next week?
You can't read their minds.
You can't. And because you don't know for sure, you are forced to assume the absolute worst, just to be safe.
Which connects directly to this big debate they have over zero-sum versus negative-sum games. Sachs, coming from an economics background, looks at the world and sees a negative-sum game. He says, look, if we fight a war, we both lose. The victor loses just as much blood and treasure as the loser. But if we cooperate, we both win. He's always looking for that rational equilibrium where everyone benefits.
Which makes perfect logical sense from an economic standpoint. War is insanely expensive. It destroys entire economies. It interrupts global trade routes. Sachs says, why would any rational actor do this? It's inefficient.
But Mearsheimer pushes back and argues that international politics is fundamentally zero-sum. If I win, you lose. And more importantly, and this is a key concept, he argues that nations care deeply about relative gains, not just absolute gains.
Relative gains is the concept that absolutely kills international cooperation. It means it does not matter if we both get 10% richer from a trade deal.
Wait, why wouldn't that matter? Everyone's richer.
Because if you get 10% richer, but I only get 5% richer, I'm terrified. Because over 10, 20, or 30 years, that compound interest means you're going to become significantly more powerful than me. And you might use that extra wealth to build a bigger navy or better missiles and eventually wipe me out.
That is such a dark way to look at the world. It's essentially saying, I would rather we both stay poor as long as you don't get slightly ahead of me.
In the brutal realm of survival, yes. That is the rational choice for a realist. If the ultimate stakes are your literal existence, you simply cannot allow a potential rival to outpace you, even in peacetime.
Wow.
So Mearsheimer's final verdict on Sachs' theory is that spheres of security is a lovely normative idea, meaning it describes how the world should be, but it completely ignores the harsh incentives of how the world actually is.
Okay, so Mearsheimer doesn't just dismiss it. He actually breaks down his critique into 3 fatal flaws.
Yeah.
And I really want to go through these in detail because they do such a good job exposing the potential cracks in Sachs' proposal. Let's start with the first one, which I'll call the definition problem.
Right. The fundamental question of where does the sphere actually end?
Sachs says, stay out of my neighborhood. Okay, sure. For the U.S., that's clearly the Western Hemisphere. We've been claiming that since 1823 with the Monroe Doctrine. And for Russia, they argue their neighborhood is Eastern Europe.
But Mearsheimer points straight to the messy parts of the map. Look at East Asia. This is probably the hardest puzzle piece to fit into Sachs's theory.
Yeah, East Asia is incredibly complex.
China feels that the South China Sea and maybe even the first island chain, those islands leading out into the Pacific, they feel that is their natural neighborhood. They argue they need that buffer zone to be secure.
But wait, that neighborhood includes Japan? It includes the Philippines. It includes Taiwan.
Exactly the problem. The United States has long-standing defense treaties with Japan and the Philippines. We have thousands of troops stationed there. We have major naval bases there.
Right.
The U.S. would never, ever agree that all of East Asia is just naturally China's sphere of security. And conversely, China would never agree that the U.S. has a legitimate right to encircle them with military bases in Korea and Japan.
So you have a situation where both great powers claim the exact same territory as their necessary, non-negotiable safety zone.
And Mearsheimer also brings up the historical example of Cold War Europe to prove this point. Who owned Central and Western Europe? It wasn't a natural, geographically obvious sphere for either the U.S. or the USSR.
No, they spent decades fighting proxy battles over it.
They fought over it because the lines weren't drawn by nature, they were drawn by tanks at the end of World War II. So simply telling nations to respect the neighborhood might work for a place like Mexico regarding the U.S., but it totally falls apart when you look at Vietnam or Poland or Germany, where these massive geopolitical interests heavily overlap.
Okay, so geography is inherently messy. You can't just draw a neat circle on a map. The second flaw Mearsheimer brings up is what I'll call the bleed-over effect. And honestly, this one really clicked for me when I was reviewing the source.
It's a very strong argument against compartmentalization.
Because Sachs admits that outside of these specific, defined spheres, great powers are still going to compete. The U.S. and China will still race for critical minerals in Africa, for example.
Right. Sachs's whole thing is let them compete economically in Africa, just don't put ballistic missiles in Taiwan. He wants to compartmentalize the conflict, keep the military out of the core spheres, keep the competition in the periphery.
But Mearsheimer counters that by saying, you just can't wall off the competition like that. The modern world is way too interconnected.
He uses the Middle East as the perfect example to illustrate this bleed over.
It's such a brilliant connection to make.
It really is. Think about the logistics. China relies heavily on importing oil from the Persian Gulf to keep its economy running. To get that oil back home, Chinese tanker ships have to travel from the Gulf all the way across the Indian Ocean, through the Strait of Malacca, which is this incredibly narrow, vulnerable choke point, and then up through the South China Sea.
And who is currently patrolling most of those waters? The U.S. Navy.
Exactly. The U.S. Navy is the dominant force there. So if the U.S. and China are competing for influence in the Middle East, say, over who gets the best contracts or who controls the flow of oil, that competition is going to inevitably bleed right back into East Asia.
Right, because if things get really tense in the Gulf, the U.S. might implicitly threaten to blockade that Strait of Malacca.
And suddenly, what started as a regional economic dispute in the Middle East becomes an absolute existential survival issue right in China's backyard.
So you can't just say, hey guys, let's be peaceful friends in Asia, but ruthless rivals in the Middle East. The entire geopolitical board is connected.
Mearsheimer argues that if you are fighting for global dominance, you actually have a massive strategic incentive to mess with your enemy's backyard just to distract them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. If the U.S. is putting heavy pressure on China in the Gulf, China might decide to stir up political trouble or fund anti-U.S. factions in Latin America, the U.S.'s core backyard, just to give the Americans a major headache closer to home. You simply cannot isolate these spheres. Conflict spreads like a virus.
Which brings us to the third fatal flaw. And honestly, this might be the most depressing part of the whole debate. It's the trust deficit, or as Mearsheimer formally puts it, the problem of uncertainty.
This is really the beating heart of structural realism. Sachs wants treaties. He wants these binding mutual security guarantees. We all sit down, we sign a piece of paper saying, I promise not to invade your sphere.
Right, and we base our whole civilized society on contracts, so why not this?
Because Mearsheimer says those papers are fundamentally worthless in international relations.
Why? I mean, treaties have held before.
Because of the time factor.
Right.
In domestic society, if you break a contract, I take you to court. The government enforces it. In the international system, there is no court with actual hard power to enforce the contract against a great power.
The UN can't arrest the US or China.
Exactly. And more importantly, intentions change over time. You might entirely trust the current leader of a rival nation today. Maybe you trust Jeffrey Sachs if he were somehow president. But who is going to be in charge of that country in 10 or 20 years?
Mearsheimer brings up Trump here as an example, right? He says, who predicted Donald Trump back in the 1990s?
Nobody predicted that, and that is exactly his point. Back in the 90s, the U.S. establishment looked at China and thought, hey, let's trade with them, let's bring them into the WTO. They'll inevitably become a liberal democracy.
That was the whole strategy.
Right. Now, the U.S. looks at China and sees its primary superpower rival. Their perceived intentions flip 180 degrees, and capabilities shift drastically over decades, too.
Yeah, China in 1990 was militarily very weak compared to the U.S.
But China in 2025 is a military and economic titan.
So Mearsheimer's ultimate conclusion here is, because I cannot possibly know who will be leading your country in 20 years, and because I can't know if your society will change its mind about being peaceful, I am forced to be ruthless right now.
Yes. I have to prepare for the absolute worst-case scenario today, because if I wait until the threat is obvious in 20 years, it will be too late to stop you.
So you expand your sphere aggressively, you heavily secure your borders, and you actively try to suppress your rivals while you still have the power to do so.
That is the tragedy. You don't necessarily want to be aggressive, but you are forced to be aggressive just to ensure you survive an uncertain future.
It is a really grim picture of human nature. It really is. But let's move from all this high-level theory down to reality. Because both of them, Sachs and Mearsheimer, take this theoretical framework and apply it directly to the war in Ukraine.
Right.
And this was genuinely surprising to me as I was going through the source material. Despite their massive theoretical differences, Sachs the idealist versus Mearsheimer the realist, they completely agree on what actually caused this war.
They are in lockstep on this, and along with the moderator Glenn Deason, there is a very clear consensus in this specific discussion that NATO expansion into Ukraine, and previously the promise to Georgia, was the catastrophic mistake that broke the system.
They argue it directly violated the core logic of this fear of security.
From the Russian perspective, and this is how the speakers in the source report it, NATO moving into Ukraine isn't just a political annoyance. It is viewed as a literal existential threat.
And they emphasize it's not just about, oh, Putin hates democracy. It's about, as they put it, physics.
The physics of missile flight times, this is crucial. Sachs specifically mentions the 3-minute warning.
3 minutes.
Yeah. If the U.S. or NATO puts advanced hypersonic missiles in Ukraine, or even those Mk-41 missile launchers that are currently used for defense systems in Poland and Romania, the actual flight time from the Ukrainian border to Moscow is just a few minutes.
They refer to it as a decapitation strike scenario.
Right. The absolute nightmare fear for Russian leadership is that the U.S. could launch a strike that wipes out Moscow's command and control before the Russian president even has time to pick up the red phone and retaliate.
And the argument is whether the U.S. actually intends to do that or not doesn't even matter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
From a security standpoint, Russia simply cannot tolerate the capability existing right on its border.
Sachs brings up a very famous American historical event as the parallel here, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
It is the perfect mirror image to help American listeners understand the dynamic. In 1962, the Soviets put nuclear missiles in Cuba. Now, why did the U.S. administration absolutely freak out?
Not because they just really hated the Cuban people.
No, because Soviet nukes sitting 90 miles off the coast of Florida meant the U.S. suddenly had virtually zero warning time for an incoming attack.
The U.S. was ready to literally blow up the entire world to force the removal of those missiles.
And Sachs's argument is that Russia feels exactly the same way about NATO military infrastructure moving into Ukraine. The geography triggers the exact same existential panic.
This is where Glenn Deason, the moderator, steps in and adds a really important diplomatic layer to the conversation. He frames it as this clash between sovereign rights on one side and indivisible security on the other.
This is the absolute crux of why the post-Cold War diplomacy failed so spectacularly. The West, and NATO specifically, stuck very rigidly to the principle that Ukraine has a sovereign right to choose its own alliances.
Which, to a Western listener, sounds completely fair. Hey, it's a free country. They can sign treaties with whoever they want.
It's a foundational liberal principle. But the opposing principle, which Russia was screaming about, is indivisible security. The idea we mentioned earlier. You cannot enhance your own security if doing so severely compromises the security of your neighbor.
Right. Russia says, sure, you are an independent sovereign state, but you do not have the right to bring a heavily armed, historically hostile military alliance right up to my front porch.
Deason argues that the West basically tried to ignore this sphere reality for decades. They tried to pretend that NATO is just a political club or a defensive alliance that no one should fear.
But the sources argue that ignoring the geopolitical reality of that expansion directly led to the war.
It really highlights the painful difference between what is quote-unquote fair and what is actually safe in international relations. It might be entirely fair and legally justified for Ukraine to want to join NATO, but practically speaking, it wasn't safe.
And Mearsheimer would probably add that in the realm of geopolitics, the concept of fair doesn't even exist. Only hard power and security exist.
He would absolutely argue that great powers trample the sovereign rights of smaller powers all the time, every day, when their core security is on the line. It's an ugly reality, but it is a consistent one historically.
Speaking of history, they don't just focus on Ukraine. The debate goes into some really fascinating historical deep dives to test out these two competing theories. And one of the biggest what-ifs they discuss is the German question.
This was a major highlight of the discussion for me. They look closely at the fate of Germany after World War II.
Sachs argues that the United States actually missed a massive historical opportunity right after the war ended. He talks about something called the Stalin-Kennan plan.
Right. George Kennan was this very famous U.S. diplomat, basically the architect of the entire Cold War containment strategy against the Soviets.
But interestingly, regarding Germany specifically, the sources note that Kennan and Stalin actually had surprisingly similar ideas at one very brief point.
The idea floating around was, let's make a unified Germany into a completely neutral, heavily demilitarized buffer state.
Like a giant Switzerland sitting right in the middle of Europe.
Exactly. Neither the West nor the East gets to use Germany as a staging ground.
Sachs passionately argues that if we had actually done that, if we had established that neutral sphere of security buffer, the entire Cold War might have ended decades earlier.
He thinks there would have been no need to form NATO or the Warsaw Pact in the way they did, facing off directly across the Fulda Gap.
But Mearsheimer disagrees with this violently.
Oh, completely. He thinks that's a terrible idea.
Why? I mean, logically, wouldn't a neutral, unarmed Germany be vastly better than a country sliced down the middle with nuclear weapons pointed at each other?
Mearsheimer looks at the geography and the history of Germany, this massive industrial, technological powerhouse located dead in the center of the European continent. And he says, neutrality for Germany is a dangerous fantasy.
Because you can't trust them to stay neutral.
Exactly. You simply cannot guarantee they stay peaceful forever. What if this neutral Germany decides to secretly rearm in 20 years? Or worse, what if a unified, powerful Germany suddenly decides to politically align with the Soviets down the road?
Then the balance of power shifts drastically, and you're looking at World War III.
Right. So Mearsheimer actually believes that the terrifying Cold War solution, physically splitting Germany in half with a wall, was actually the best, most stable solution possible under the circumstances.
Really, the Berlin Wall was the best-case scenario.
From a realist perspective, yes. He argues that partitioning Germany into East and West definitively managed the power balance. The U.S. strictly controlled one half, the Soviets strictly controlled the other.
It was ugly, it was undeniably tragic for the German families living there, but it was structurally stable.
It entirely removed the uncertainty. You didn't have to guess what Germany was going to do because they couldn't do anything independently.
That is just classic, ruthless realism. I prefer a concrete wall and a divided, occupied country over the terrifying uncertainty of a free, neutral one.
It is. But then Sachs counters this dark view of history with his own historical example. He brings up the concept of the Confucian peace. He goes way, way back to the Ming Dynasty in China, stretching from 1368 all the way to 1839.
Right. He uses this to try and prove that a great power doesn't inherently have to be an aggressive predator.
Exactly. For centuries, China was the undisputed hegemon of East Asia. They were the biggest, richest, most technologically advanced state by a mile.
But Sachs points out, despite all that overwhelming power, they really didn't fight massive wars of conquest with their immediate neighbors like Vietnam or Korea or Japan. They didn't militarily occupy them.
Instead, they utilized what historians call the tribute system.
The kowtow.
Right. Basically, the neighboring kingdoms had to formally acknowledge that the Chinese emperor was the absolute boss. They sent lavish gifts. They performed rituals showing deep respect.
But in exchange for that symbolic submission, China essentially left them alone to run their own affairs.
They didn't strip mine their resources. They didn't force regime changes every 10 years. They didn't demand exclusive economic control. They just wanted quiet borders.
So Sachs uses this massive chunk of history to say, look, John, look at the data. It is practically possible to be a global superpower and not act like a violent imperialist. We can construct a sphere of security today without it inevitably sliding into tragedy.
It's a very compelling historical argument against the realist assumption that conflict is biologically or structurally inevitable.
But what is the realist counter to that?
Well, the realist counter, which Mearsheimer strongly hints at when discussing modern economics, would be that the world is fundamentally smaller and tighter now.
In what way?
In the 1400s, the Ming Dynasty didn't desperately need advanced semiconductors from a factory in Taiwan or millions of barrels of oil from Saudi Arabia just to keep its society functioning.
Ah, right. Modern supply chains.
Modern technology and highly integrated global markets make it infinitely harder to just graciously leave your neighbors alone, especially when your own domestic survival relies entirely on the resources located inside their borders.
Which perfectly transitions us into the actual mechanics of survival in the modern age. The sources get a little nerdy here with game theory, but it is absolutely crucial to understand why Sachs and Mearsheimer fundamentally disagree on our chances for peace. We touched on the prisoner's dilemma earlier.
Yes, the prisoner's dilemma is the classic thought experiment in international relations. Two criminals are arrested and put in separate interrogation rooms.
If they both stay silent, if they cooperate with each other, they both get a very light sentence.
But if one rats out the other, the rat goes free immediately, and the silent guy gets a life sentence. If they panic and both rat each other out, they both get a medium, pretty bad sentence.
So Sachs, thinking like an economist, analyzes this and looks for the optimal equilibrium. He says cooperation, both staying silent, is clearly the best logical outcome for everyone involved.
And he believes that if you play this game over and over again, what he calls repeated interactions, the players eventually learn to trust each other.
Right. If I know I have to deal with you tomorrow and next year and the year after that, I have a strong selfish incentive to be nice to you today. He thinks treaties and trade agreements systematically build this trust over time.
But Mearsheimer throws a massive wrench into that optimistic logic with that concept we discussed earlier, relative gains.
Right, the scoreboard checking.
Exactly. In the
Yeah.
classic isolated prisoner's dilemma, you theoretically only care about minimizing your own jail time. But Mearsheimer argues that nation-states are deeply, inherently jealous and paranoid.
So how does that change the game?
It changes the math completely.
Mm-hmm.
If we cooperate on a trade deal and the result is that I get 2 years in jail but you go completely free, I might actually prefer that we blow up the deal and both get 5 years in jail just to ensure you don't get a significant advantage over me.
That is the ultimate realist twist. The overriding fear that your partner will gain slightly more from peace than you do, and then eventually use that extra strength to crush you.
And that paranoia is exactly why Mearsheimer says long-term cooperation is so incredibly hard to sustain. States are constantly checking that relative scoreboard. They're constantly asking, did China's economy grow by 6% this year, while ours only grew by 2%?
If the answer is yes, then the realist says this peaceful trade system is actually actively harming our long-term survival. We need to break it.
Exactly.
But this is where Sachs plays his ultimate trump card in the debate, the nuclear revolution.
Yes. This is essentially his stop the madness argument.
He argues that all this dry, realist talk about relative gains and constant strategic competition becomes completely, literally suicidal the second you introduce thermonuclear weapons into the equation.
Right. In game theory, there's a strategy called hawk-hawk, where both sides choose to act as aggressively as possible. In the 1800s, playing hawk-hawk was just inefficient and bloody.
But today, playing hawk-hawk against a nuclear-armed power isn't just inefficient. It's the literal end of human civilization.
Sachs takes that doomsday clock we mentioned at the start incredibly seriously. It's not just a metaphor for him. He argues that because the stakes are now total annihilation, we simply must stumble forward with these imperfect treaties.
We do have a choice.
We have to try to build trust, even if it carries strategic risks, because the alternative is certain death for everybody. He frames modern war as a negative-sum game where everyone loses everything.
So Sachs is essentially saying to Mearsheimer, look, I don't even care if your grim logic is historically perfectly accurate. The invention of the hydrogen bomb means we have to consciously evolve past our own history.
Exactly. We have to actively override our deep biological drive for dominance because the weapons we've built have simply become too powerful for the old games. We cannot afford to play by 19th century imperial rules when we're holding 21st century apocalyptic weapons.
It's a really powerful point. Now, let's pivot and look at the current implications of all this theory, because they take this framework and apply it to what we are seeing in the news right now.
And one of the most interesting current observations Sachs raises is what I'd call the reputation argument, specifically regarding Russia and the Ukraine war.
Yeah, this was eye-opening. The West, meaning the US, the UK, Europe, was absolutely convinced that when Putin ordered the invasion of Ukraine, he would instantly become a global pariah, totally isolated, alone on the world stage.
But Sachs points out that if you look at the actual geopolitical map, look at the global south, look at major powers in Africa, Asia, Latin America, do they actually isolate Russia?
No, not at all. India is buying massive amounts of Russian oil. Brazil is actively trading with them. South Africa is hosting joint naval drills with the Russian Navy.
Why is that? Why didn't the rest of the world immediately side with the moral outrage of the West?
Sachs argues it's because the global south simply doesn't buy the unprovoked war narrative that is so common in Western media.
Right. They watched the U.S. systematically expanding NATO eastward for decades. They watched the U.S. violating the core norm of the sphere of security.
So to much of the global south, the U.S. actually looks like the arrogant provocateur who relentlessly poked the bear until the bear finally snapped.
They view the war not as a black and white morality play between good and evil, but as a classic, messy, great power dispute over border security.
That is a massive blind spot for Western listeners, I think. We kind of just naturally assume everyone globally sees the war exactly the way CNN or the BBC presents it.
But Sachs is highlighting that most of the world sees it entirely through this sphere of security lens. The U.S. aggressively pushed into Russia's perceived neighborhood, and Russia reacted exactly the way a cornered great power always reacts.
And this observation connects directly to their predictions for the future, particularly concerning Africa and the Middle East.
Right. Sachs suggests, very practically, that African nations need to form a much stronger, more unified political bloc, something akin to a highly integrated EU.
Specifically to avoid becoming a playground for this exact kind of great power competition.
Because if they don't organize collectively, the US, China, and Russia are going to tear the continent apart, fighting proxy wars over critical resources like cobalt and copper. It's the get organized or get eaten rule of geopolitics.
And Mearsheimer looks at the map and predicts that the next massive global flashpoint won't just be Taiwan, but the Persian Gulf.
Right, tying back to that bleed over effect. As China continues to aggressively build up its blue water navy, it is inevitably going to want to physically secure its own vital oil supply lines coming out of the Middle East.
But the U.S. considers the Persian Gulf to be basically an American lake.
Exactly. So you are going to have the rapidly expanding Chinese Navy sailing right into waters that the U.S. Navy believes it fundamentally owns.
Which proves Mearsheimer's point. You can't just define a neat sphere and hide inside it. You can't hide from the tragedy.
The structural forces just keep pushing these powers into conflict.
So as we wrap up this incredibly deep dive into the source material, we are essentially left with a very stark choice between these two comprehensive worldviews.
On one hand, you have Mearsheimer, the structural realist, saying, you cannot take the tragedy off the table.
It's baked into the system.
The very structure of the world, the anarchy, the unavoidable uncertainty, the deep-seated fear, means that conflict is eventually inevitable. We have to be incredibly tough, utterly ruthless, and just accept that building hard spheres of influence is the only proven way to temporarily stay safe.
And on the other hand, you have Sachs saying, we have to try to be better or we literally die.
Right.
He believes we can systematically create these spheres of security where we genuinely respect each other's geographical red lines. We keep the military hardware out, but we keep the global trade open.
He fundamentally believes we have the capacity to write a new script, because following the old historical script now guarantees it all ends in a mushroom cloud.
It really changes how you read the morning news, doesn't it? When you see a quick headline about, say, a new U.S. military base opening in the Philippines or a Russian nuclear submarine popping up off the coast of Cuba.
You stop asking, oh, is this fair to the locals? And you immediately start asking, is this fundamentally violating a great power's security sphere?
You start seeing the cold mechanics of the security dilemma operating in real time every single day.
It gives you a much sharper, albeit much more anxiety-inducing lens to view international relations.
So we want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over based on all of this. If Mearsheimer is ultimately right, and the structure of the world means we can never truly know the intentions of another country, is lasting peace actually impossible?
Are we just desperately managing the terrifying, shortening time gaps between inevitable world wars?
Or, if Sachs is right, does the continued survival of the human race now absolutely depend on us consciously unlearning 10,000 years of biological programming? Can we somehow choose to trust a rival when every single evolutionary instinct we have screams at us to defend ourselves?
It's the ultimate tightrope walk.
The next time you look at a globe, don't just look at the neat little borders drawn in ink. Look at the neighborhoods. Because as we've learned from this deep dive today, knowing how to stay out of the wrong neighborhood might be the absolute only thing keeping that doomsday clock from finally striking midnight.
It is an incredibly precarious balance we're all relying on.
It really is. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today.
Yeah.
Keep looking at the map differently, stay curious, stay informed, and we'll catch you on the next one.